Ladies and gentlemen, time for our first installment of Unit 9. I hope you're doing well. This is our last unit. And the long and winding road. Boom, boom. We're almost done, almost to the end of this show. And then it's all the way back to the beginning. 50-some days from now, AP exam, winner, chicken dinner. Okay, so we're going to do this first page and just the first page. And then we'll have a Kennedy video and a Lyndon Johnson video and a Nixon video. And it's on the way. Okay, so let's start with this video here on Vietnam. Okay, when we look at Vietnam, the first player we have to talk about is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is the leader of a political movement called the Viet Minh. His goal is to get from the world the blessings of the major states for an independent, unified Vietnam. Now, Vietnam has a long history of being subdued by other countries, but they also have a very long history of fighting back against those other countries. So while the Chinese and the Japanese and most recently the French attempted to put the Vietnamese under their boot, the Vietnamese fought back and were a very, very tough people to subdue. Maybe we should have thought about that in our policy making. Yeah. Let's write that down. Maybe we should have thought about that. Okay, so unfortunately for Vietnam, they're not going to get what they want. So allow me to bounce down a little bit. Let's go to the first president on our chart, and that's President Harry Truman. At the end of World War II, Vietnam is hoping that they will be given their independence. Vietnam is a territory that was controlled by the Japanese at various parts during World War II, and now they'd like to be free and on their own. Not going to happen. Unfortunately, the French are going to wish to reestablish their colonial claims in what they're going to call French Indochina. Now, Truman is between a rock and a hard place. Truman needs the support of the French in order to assure that his plans of NATO in Europe will also be secure. So he has to give the French United States backing for what the French want in Indochina. So while we might look at someone like Ho Chi Minh and respect the fact that he has the right ideas, that is to say independence and American values in that sense, we're suspicious of him. And our suspicion really stems from the fact that he's a communist. Now, here's the crux of the American problem. We see communist, and that's a red flag, like my shirt, a red flag. We're not willing to look beyond that. Here's what Ho Chi Minh would like us to do. He'd like us to not see him as a socialist in the sense of being a pawn of the Soviet Union or a pawn of China after 1949 when they go socialist. He wants us to see him as a country that's independent and nationalist and also happens to be socialist. And we just can't do that. We see the socialist part, and that's what consumes us, and that's what's going to consume us for the next 30 years. In our eyes, we see him as a pawn of the Soviet Union and of the Chinese. We see this as part of the Cold War, not a civil war. That's the point that McNamara was making in the video the other day. Now, in all fairness to American policymakers, did Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh and their military wing, the Viet Cong, did they accept money from the Soviet Union and from the Chinese? Yes. Yes, they did. So in a sense, although people can criticize the American policy and say we committed ourselves there and we got ourselves into a lot of a mess, it did look like this was a domino falling. It did. Let's move down this chair, or down the scale here, I say, to Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower is the President of the United States in the mid-1950s when the French bail at a famous battle called Dien Bien Phu. In the far north of Vietnam, the French lose control of a very important strategic fort. And when they lose that fort, the message that they send to the United States is, we can't go on. We cannot continue to fight and to hold this together. And you guys are going to have to take over for us here. So Eisenhower's plight is, what do? Do we simply step aside and allow the North Vietnamese socialist influence forces to trample through the South and to really have another Korean War, but in a sense, the opposite happen where the Northern Communist force just mows them down and we let it happen? We can't allow that to happen. And so Eisenhower begins a yearly budget of about $200 million where we're giving money to the people in South Vietnam. Now, we also install our own leader, a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. The Diem regime, unfortunately, does not get along very well with the people of South Vietnam. Diem himself has spent a lot of time in the United States. We trust him. Part of the reason we trust him is he's not a socialist, but he also doesn't have a lot in common with the Vietnamese people. He views them in a very harsh way. He's a Catholic, not a Buddhist, like a lot of the people who lived in Vietnam, and therefore his attempts to try and bring the people of South Vietnam around to his viewpoint, that is to say our viewpoint, are not very successful. Also, a problem for Diem is that he organizes a lot of the people into these strategic hamlets. The strategic hamlets were areas where we, the United States and the South Vietnamese, felt that we could protect the South Vietnamese from the North Vietnamese forces, the Viet Cong. Unfortunately, the people didn't see them as protection, they saw them as being in prison. And that led to a lot of negative backlash. Remember, we saw that iconic photograph of Thich Quang Duc, the monk, setting himself on fire in opposition to a lot of the policies of the Diem regime. So when Eisenhower leaves office in 1961, Vietnam is heating up. There were supposed to be elections in 1956 to unify the country. That's something that we did not allow to happen because, frankly, we knew if there were elections, we were going to lose them. And therefore, there are two Vietnams. There's North Vietnam, the one controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, and then the one in the south, controlled by Ngo Dinh Diem, and heavily financed by the United States. And that's the mess that we throw into the lap of President Kennedy. And here begins the debate. President Kennedy, had he lived, had he not been gunned down in 1963, historians argue, and I like this idea, that Kennedy would have withdrawn us from Vietnam. That during Kennedy's time, we had about 16,000 advisors on the ground in Vietnam, but that Kennedy had looked at the board, he'd looked at the possibilities, and he frankly didn't see anything that could come from 3, 4, 500,000 troops. He didn't see it. What Johnson ends up doing in the war, Kennedy would not have done. And therefore, Kennedy's death is in a way controversial. There are a lot of people who have their conspiracy theories about why Kennedy was killed. Although Kennedy was willing to give advisors to the South Vietnamese and to give them money, he was not willing to commit American forces there. Kennedy thought that that was just hopeless. Maybe somebody took him out. Maybe the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address. Maybe it was individuals within the American government. Maybe the Pentagon, who wanted the military to assert itself in Vietnam and take a strong stand and thought Kennedy was pulling them back. We'll never really know the answer to that one. But unfortunately, Kennedy is shot in November of 1963, and that brings us into the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson has a different approach. Johnson believes that it's time for the United States to put a more aggressive line into Vietnam. He gets the opportunity to do that by an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In August of 1964, two American ships, the Turner Joyce and the Maddox, are fired upon, or maybe not necessarily fired upon, that's the video part we watched, but one of them for sure was fired upon, we think. And as a result of it, there were bombing raids in North Vietnam. Now, these bombing raids are a part of what Johnson calls Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder is an enormous bombing raid where we hit the North Vietnamese and hit them and hit them and hit them, and unfortunately it doesn't seem to do the trick. We're trying to hit the infrastructure, we're trying to hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we're just not hitting the right spots. The other part of the Johnson movement, and he is oddly enough reluctant to do it, but thinks that if we don't do it, we're going to lose the ground that we have gained, and that's the movement of ground forces into Vietnam. Under Johnson, America goes from those 16,000 advisors we talked about with President Kennedy to 540,000 men by the time Johnson leaves office in 1969. Unfortunately for the United States, it didn't seem to make a difference how many troops we put there. 3, 4, 500,000 didn't bring a surrender from the North Vietnamese. In fact, if we remember that Tet incident in January of 1968, that's one of the things on our study guide for 68, we'll talk about that later, we get the sense that we're not winning, that the North Vietnamese are on the advantage, that they're pushing us back, and that unfortunately we are not where we thought we were in that war. When Johnson leaves office in 1969, he leaves President Nixon then with a huge amount of troops in South Vietnam, and unfortunately we haven't really resolved the issue. Nixon promises in his campaign in '68 that he will win peace with honor, that we will withdraw ourselves from this conflict, but we will do so in a way that is honorable and befitting other nations of the world. Now, the other thing you have to understand, though, about Nixon is that Nixon is in a way admitting that the checkbook is getting a little low. We have spent money. The New Deal, World War II, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the Korean War, the buildup of nuclear weapons in the 1950s, the Great Society, all of the money we've spent in Vietnam, and oh my goodness, the money. And what Nixon in a way is saying is, we're no longer the checkbook for the world. We don't have money for every single cause around the world. We need it for some domestic issues. We need to pull back the American forces in an honorable way in order to try and bring America back to a stability and a happiness. Remember, Nixon takes over in 1968, or in 1969, I beg your pardon, in the early part of the year, and things are blowing up all over the place. So the America that Nixon inherits would make you want to focus on domestic affairs if you could. Now, Nixon's plan for getting us out of Vietnam is twofold. It's called Vietnamization. That is a gradual lowering of the number of American troops on the ground, which is something that he sticks to. And by 1973, the last American forces leave South Vietnam. Unfortunately, about 2 years later, the North Vietnamese roll in and take over South Vietnam. So if you're looking at, did we achieve our objective? Did we keep the South safe from the North? The answer to that, unfortunately, is we didn't. Now, Nixon gets himself in a lot of hot water in Vietnam because he believes that instead of just bombing North Vietnam, the United States should bomb areas outside of North Vietnam. And that's why we begin bombing Cambodia and Laos, territories that are adjacent to North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And in all fairness to Nixon, if you followed that border all the way along there, the Ho Chi Minh Trail didn't really run inside of Vietnam. It ran on the other side of the spine of Vietnam, down through Cambodia and Laos, and then back into South Vietnam. So for all the bombs that President Johnson dropped to try and bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, pardon me, President Johnson, but you're bombing in the wrong spot. They're actually in the neighboring country. Nixon really doesn't have permission to go and bomb these countries, but Nixon permission, better to beg forgiveness than ask permission, right? That's the old saying. And so Nixon bombed areas there, and of course, once these things come out that we've been doing that, there are huge protests, most notably the one at Kent State University in May of 1970. Overall, the American experience in Vietnam is unfortunately a cautionary tale. It leads us to understand that not every time the United States sends its military forces out into the world are we going to ratchet up a victory and be able to come home the conquering hero. Even in Korea, we managed to restore the country to the state in which we found it. In Vietnam, we can't even say we did that. Unfortunately for the country, the people who fought in that war came home and were mistreated to the worst degree of any veterans we've ever had. Hopefully something we never see again. Next video will be about John F. Kennedy. Have a good night.